The laughter echoed across the ballroom. Then my wife screamed. Every guest turned toward our table as my daughter-in-law stood there, holding my wife's wig above her head, smiling as though she had just won a game. My wife covered her bald head with shaking hands while tears filled her eyes. A few people left. Others pulled out their phones. Nobody in that room knew the truth yet. But before my son's wedding ended, every person who laughed would wish they had stayed silent. My name is John Carter. I am 71 years old, and I have learned that the deepest pain rarely comes from strangers. It usually comes from the people you spend your life protecting. My wife Emily and I had been married for 43 years. Together we built a simple life filled with love, hard work, and sacrifice. We were never rich, but we always made sure our son Daniel had every opportunity we never had. We worked extra jobs, skipped vacations, and saved every dollar we could so he could graduate without debt and build a better future. Watching him become a successful man was the proudest achievement of our lives. Then, 2 years before his wedding, everything changed. Emily was diagnosed with breast cancer. I still remember the doctor quietly closing the office door before speaking. I knew the news was bad before he opened the file. The months that followed tested every promise we had ever made to each other. There were surgeries, chemotherapy sessions, endless hospital visits, and nights when I sat beside her bed praying that God would give us one more morning together. Emily lost her strength, then her energy, and finally her hair. The first time she looked into the bathroom mirror without it, she broke down in tears. She whispered, "John, I do not recognize the woman looking back at me." I held her hands and replied, "I still see the woman I fell in love with." A few weeks later, she bought a simple brown wig. It helped her smile again, even if only a little. Very few people knew it was not her real hair. Daniel knew. His fiancée Melissa knew. Emily trusted Melissa like a daughter because she believed family protected each other's pain instead of exposing it. On the morning of the wedding, Emily stood in front of the mirror adjusting her wig again and again. She smiled nervously and asked, "Do I look beautiful enough for our son's big day?" I kissed her forehead and answered, "You are the most beautiful woman in every room you walk into because you never gave up." She smiled, took my hand, and together we drove to the wedding believing it would become one of the happiest days of our lives. Neither of us knew that someone inside that ballroom had already planned a cruel prank, and my wife was about to become the target. The wedding venue looked beautiful. Fresh flowers covered every table, soft music filled the ballroom, and smiling guests greeted us as we walked inside. Emily relaxed a little after several relatives complimented her dress. Nobody mentioned her wig. Nobody stared at her. I quietly thanked God for giving her the confidence to enjoy this special day. Daniel walked over with a smile and hugged us both. "Dad, Mom, thank you for coming early. It means everything to me." Emily kissed his cheek and straightened his tie just as she had done on his first day of school many years earlier. For a moment, everything felt perfect. Then Melissa approached us. She smiled warmly, hugged Emily, and whispered, "You look amazing today." Emily smiled back and thanked her. Watching them together made me believe Emily had finally gained the daughter she always wanted. I could not have been more mistaken. During the reception, I noticed Melissa speaking quietly with 3 bridesmaids. They kept glancing toward our table before laughing among themselves. I tried to ignore it, telling myself they were simply excited about the wedding. A few minutes later, one bridesmaid walked past Emily and said, "Your hair looks so real today." The others laughed before quickly walking away. Emily looked confused but forced herself to smile. I leaned closer and asked, "Are you all right?" She nodded and quietly replied, "Maybe I am just imagining things." I wanted to believe she was right. As dinner was served, I saw Melissa pick up her phone and show something to the bridesmaids. They burst into laughter, again while looking directly at Emily. My stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. I stood up to get us both a drink. But before I reached the refreshment table, I overheard one of the bridesmaids whisper, "Everyone is going to remember this wedding forever." Another answered, "Wait until Melissa does it. The whole room will explode." I stopped walking. My heart suddenly felt heavy. I turned toward them, but they immediately changed the subject and walked away smiling. I returned to our table without saying anything because I did not want to worry. Emily on our son's wedding day. She looked at me and asked, John, why do you look so concerned? I forced a smile and replied, it is probably nothing. Deep inside, however, I knew I was wrong. Across the ballroom, Melissa picked up a microphone and smiled at the wedding planner. A few seconds later, the music stopped, and every guest turned toward the stage. The ceremony ended with smiles, applause, and family photographs. But I noticed something I could not ignore. Melissa kept whispering to her bridesmaids while looking toward Emily. Every time they glanced at my wife, they laughed quietly before looking away. Emily pretended not to notice, but after 43 years of marriage, I knew every expression on her face. I leaned closer and asked, are you all right? She forced a smile and replied, I am fine. I am probably just nervous. I wished I believed her. During the reception, guests surrounded Daniel and Melissa to congratulate them. Emily stayed near our table, speaking with a few relatives who asked about her health. She answered every question with kindness and never mentioned the pain she had endured. One elderly woman hugged her and whispered, you look wonderful, Emily. My wife smiled warmly, but I noticed her hand quietly touching her wig every few minutes. She was making sure it had not moved. She had become so used to hiding her illness that even after beating cancer, she still feared people discovering what she had been through. A little later, Melissa walked over carrying 2 glasses of champagne. She handed one to Emily and smiled sweetly. You have to relax today, she said. This is a celebration. Emily thanked her, believing every word came from love. As Melissa walked away, I noticed her exchanging another glance with her bridesmaids. One of them covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. A strange feeling settled in my chest. I had spent my entire life trusting my instincts, and they had rarely been wrong. I quietly told Emily, if you feel uncomfortable at any time, we will leave immediately. She gently squeezed my hand and shook her head. Not today, John. Daniel has waited for this day his whole life. I do not want anything to ruin it. I smiled, but deep inside I feared it was already too late. A few minutes later, the master of ceremonies picked up the microphone and announced, everyone, please gather around. The bride has prepared one final surprise that nobody will ever forget. The wedding reception had finally begun, and for a short while, it felt as though the painful conversation from earlier had been forgotten. Guests were laughing, children were running between the tables, and music filled the ballroom. Emily slowly relaxed. She smiled at old friends, thanked relatives for their kind words, and even laughed when one of our grandchildren pulled her onto the dance floor. Watching her smile again filled my heart with relief. I quietly thanked God that she was beginning to enjoy the evening. Then Melissa walked onto the stage holding a microphone. She tapped it twice and said, before dinner, I have one last surprise that everyone is going to remember forever. The guests cheered, believing it was another wedding game. Daniel smiled without asking what she had planned. Melissa looked directly at Emily and said, Mom, I need your help for just 1 minute. Emily looked surprised but stood up anyway. She trusted Melissa completely. As she walked toward the center of the dance floor, everyone turned to watch. Melissa wrapped one arm around Emily as though they were posing for a family photograph. She smiled at the photographer and counted 1, 2, 3. Then, without warning, she grabbed the top of Emily's wig and ripped it off. The room exploded with laughter from a few tables while several guests stared in complete shock. Emily froze. Her hands instantly covered her bald head as tears filled her eyes. She could not speak. She could barely breathe. Melissa was still laughing, holding the wig high in the air as though it was the funniest prank anyone had ever seen. Then someone near the front whispered, "Wait, she has cancer." Another guest lowered their phone. The laughter began to disappear. One by one, people realized they had not witnessed a harmless joke. They had witnessed a woman who survived chemotherapy being humiliated in front of everyone she loved. I immediately removed my suit jacket, placed it over Emily's head and shoulders, and held her close. She was shaking so badly I could feel every breath. I slowly turned toward the silent ballroom and looked directly at my son. His face had turned completely pale. That was when I realized he knew exactly what Melissa had done. And what happened next would change our family forever. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the ballroom, unable to take his eyes off his mother. The smile disappeared from his face as the truth spread from table to table. Guests who had laughed only moments earlier now looked down in shame. The photographer quietly lowered his camera. Even the musicians stopped playing. Melissa slowly looked around the room, confused by the sudden silence. She expected applause. Instead, she saw tears, disbelief, and anger on the faces of people she had invited to celebrate with her. Emily buried her face against my shoulder, trembling so badly that she could barely stand. I gently whispered, "You do not have to stay here another second." She nodded. But before we could take a single step, Daniel hurried toward us. His voice shook as he asked, "Mom, are you all right?" Emily could not answer. She simply kept crying. I looked directly into my son's eyes and quietly said, "She trusted both of you with the hardest chapter of her life. Today that trust was destroyed." Daniel turned toward Melissa and asked, "Did you know?" Melissa nervously laughed and replied, "Of course I knew she wore a wig. It was only supposed to be a harmless joke. I thought everyone would laugh for a minute and move on." Several guests gasped. After hearing those words, an elderly woman stood from her chair and said, "A harmless joke does not leave a cancer survivor hiding her face." Another guest quietly wiped away tears. Melissa finally realized nobody was standing beside her anymore. She slowly lowered the wig into her hands, but the damage had already been done. Emily lifted her head just enough to look at Melissa. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I loved you like my own daughter." Those 7 words echoed through the silent ballroom more loudly than any shout ever could. Melissa's eyes filled with tears. But before she could speak, an older man walked in through the ballroom entrance carrying a small envelope. He looked around the room and asked one question that made my heart sink. "Is this where Mr. John Carter is? I have something he must see immediately." Daniel looked at the elderly man in confusion, then turned back toward me. The ballroom remained completely silent. I slowly stepped forward and accepted the envelope from the stranger. "Who sent this?" I asked. The man lowered his voice and replied, "Someone who wanted the truth to reach you before this night was over." He nodded respectfully toward Emily before quietly leaving the ballroom. Every pair of eyes followed me as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph and several printed pages. I looked at the photograph first, and my hands immediately began to shake. It showed Melissa laughing with 2 of her bridesmaids only an hour before the ceremony. Emily's wig was lying on a table beside them. One bridesmaid was pointing at it while another covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Melissa was smiling directly at the camera. My heart sank. This had not been an accident. It had been planned. I slowly handed the photograph to Daniel without saying a word. As he looked at it, the color disappeared from his face. "No," he whispered. "This cannot be real." Melissa quickly grabbed the photograph, but it was too late. Daniel had already seen enough. "You planned this?" he asked, his voice breaking. Melissa tried to explain. "It was only supposed to be funny. I never thought she would react like this." Daniel stepped back in disbelief. "She is a cancer survivor. She trusted you." Melissa reached for his hand, but he pulled away. The guests watched in complete silence. Some quietly shook their heads. Others wiped away tears as Emily remained beside me, still hiding beneath my suit jacket. Daniel slowly walked over to his mother and fell to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Mom, I failed you. I should have protected you." Emily gently placed her hand on his cheek. Even after everything that had happened, she could not stop being a mother. Before anyone could say another word, I unfolded the remaining pages inside the envelope. As I read the first line, my heart stopped. Someone had uncovered a secret about Melissa that none of us had known. And it was far worse than the cruel prank she had played. I read the first page twice because I could not believe what was written. It was a series of messages exchanged between Melissa and one of her closest friends just 3 days before the wedding. Every message had a date, a time, and screenshots that were impossible to ignore. One sentence caught my attention immediately. "Wait until everyone sees her without that ugly wig. This wedding will go viral." My hands tightened around the papers. Daniel looked at me and quietly asked, Dad, what is it? Without speaking, I handed him the pages. As he read each message, his breathing became heavier. Melissa tried to take the papers from him, but he stepped away. You planned every second of this, he said. You even joked about recording my mother while she cried. Melissa burst into tears and insisted it was never meant to go that far. I only wanted a funny wedding moment. I thought people would laugh for a few seconds. Daniel shook his head. You were not laughing with my mother. You were laughing at her. The ballroom remained silent except for Melissa's crying. Emily stood beside me, still covering her head. Then something happened that I will never forget. My wife slowly lowered my suit jacket from her head and looked directly at every guest in the room. Her voice was soft, but every person heard her. I was never ashamed of losing my hair. I was only afraid of losing my dignity. Several guests began crying. Even people who had never met Emily before lowered their heads in shame. Melissa took one step toward her and whispered, I am sorry, Emily calmly replied. An apology can heal a heart, but it cannot erase a memory. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, then removed his wedding ring. He looked at Melissa with tears in his eyes and quietly said, If this is who you truly are, then I married someone I never really knew. The room filled with gasps. Melissa's face turned completely pale. She realized this was no longer about a ruined joke. She was about to lose the marriage she had waited months to celebrate. Just then, the wedding coordinator rushed toward us and whispered something into my ear that made my heart pound once again. Someone unexpected had just arrived, and they were asking for Emily by name. The wedding coordinator pointed toward the entrance. Every guest turned to look. An elderly woman slowly walked into the ballroom carrying a small bouquet of white lilies. Emily stared at her for several seconds before whispering, Grace? The woman smiled through tears and nodded. I recognized her immediately. She had been Emily's oncology nurse during the hardest months of chemotherapy. She had retired only a few weeks after Emily completed her treatment. Grace quietly walked across the room and gently embraced my wife. The ballroom remained completely silent. After a long moment, Grace turned toward the guests and said, I was not invited to this wedding. I came because I received an anonymous message telling me that Emily had been humiliated in public. She paused, looking around the room. Many of you only met Emily tonight. I knew her on the days when she could not even lift her head from a hospital pillow. I watched her comfort other patients while she was fighting for her own life. She never complained. She never asked, why me? She only asked if everyone else was all right. Tears appeared in the eyes of several guests. Grace continued, Do you know what Emily feared most during chemotherapy? It was not losing her hair. It was becoming a burden to the people she loved. Emily lowered her head as tears rolled down her cheeks. Grace gently took her hand and said, You are one of the bravest women I have ever met, and no prank can take away your dignity. The room broke into quiet applause, but it was not a celebration. It was a sign of respect. Daniel stood beside his mother, unable to stop crying. Melissa remained alone near the stage, realizing that every person in the ballroom had turned away from her. She took a hesitant step toward Emily, hoping for another chance to apologize. Before she could speak, her father suddenly stood up from his table and looked at her with deep disappointment. His first words left the entire ballroom speechless. Melissa, I did not raise you to become someone who humiliates a cancer survivor. From this moment on, I will not defend what you have done. Melissa's father slowly walked toward the center of the ballroom. His face was pale with disappointment. He looked at his daughter for several long seconds before speaking. When your mother and I taught you to make people laugh, we never taught you to laugh at someone's pain. Melissa began crying again and tried to explain herself, but he gently raised his hand. No, tonight you will listen. The room remained silent. Every guest could feel the weight of the moment. He turned toward Emily and lowered his head. Mrs. Carter, I owe you an apology that may never be enough. I am ashamed of what happened here. Emily quietly nodded but said nothing. Some wounds were simply too deep for words. Daniel walked beside me and whispered, Dad, I cannot believe. I almost married someone capable of this. I placed my hand on his shoulder and replied, The hardest truths often reveal themselves at the last possible moment. Daniel wiped away his tears and slowly faced the guests. "Everyone," he said, "I need your attention." The ballroom became completely still. This wedding was supposed to celebrate love, respect, and family. Instead, the woman I married humiliated the person who sacrificed more for me than anyone else in this room. I cannot pretend that nothing happened. He looked at Melissa before continuing. "I need time to think about whether this marriage has any future." A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. Melissa broke down completely. She reached toward Daniel, but he quietly stepped back. At that moment, the master of ceremonies approached me with another envelope that had just been delivered. "Mr. Carter," he said softly, "this arrived a few minutes ago. It is marked urgent." I frowned because I was not expecting anything else that night. I opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter with no signature. As I read the first few lines, my heart began to race. The letter claimed that the prank at the wedding was not Melissa's idea alone. Someone much closer to our family had secretly helped plan every detail. I could hardly breathe as I finished reading the anonymous letter. It claimed that Melissa had not planned the prank by herself. Someone inside our own family had encouraged her from the very beginning. At first, I wanted to throw the letter away, believing it was written by someone trying to create more chaos. Then I noticed several printed text messages attached to the final page. They showed conversations between Melissa and my younger sister, Carol. My hands began to tremble. Carol had known Emily for more than 40 years. She knew every hospital visit, every surgery, and every painful day of chemotherapy. One message froze me where I stood. "She worries about that wig every single day. If you want a reaction, pull it off during the reception. Everyone will remember your wedding forever." I closed my eyes, hoping the words would somehow disappear. They did not. Daniel quietly asked, "Dad, who wrote that?" I handed him the pages without answering. His face turned white as he read every message. "Aunt Carol?" he whispered. "This cannot be true." Before anyone could stop him, Daniel walked across the ballroom toward my sister. She was sitting at the back of the room, avoiding everyone's eyes. "Tell me these messages are fake," he demanded. Carol remained silent. "Tell me," Daniel repeated, his voice shaking. After several painful seconds, she slowly looked up and said, "I only thought it would be a harmless joke. I never imagined it would become this serious." The ballroom erupted with shocked whispers. Emily stared at Carol with tears in her eyes. "You sat beside my hospital bed," she whispered. "You held my hand when I lost my hair. How could you do this?" Carol began crying, but no explanation could erase what everyone had just learned. Daniel turned away in disbelief. Melissa was no longer standing alone. Now another member of our family had been exposed. Just when I thought the worst truth had finally come out, my phone suddenly rang. It was our family lawyer. His first sentence made my heart stop. "John, do not leave the venue yet. I have discovered something about Melissa that changes everything." My hands tightened around the phone as I stepped away from the crowd. The noise inside the ballroom faded while I listened to my lawyer. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "John, I was reviewing the financial documents you asked me to prepare after the wedding. During that process, I discovered something unusual. Melissa has been asking questions about your estate for months." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath before answering. 3 months ago, someone contacted my office pretending to be your representative. They wanted to know how your property, investments, and trust would be divided after your death. We refused to release any information, but we kept a record of the inquiry. My heart sank. I slowly returned to the ballroom without saying a word. Daniel looked at my face and immediately knew something was wrong. "Dad, what happened?" I handed him the phone. My lawyer repeated everything directly to him. Daniel listened in complete silence. When the call ended, he lowered the phone and stared at Melissa. "Were you planning our future? Or my parents' inheritance?" Melissa immediately shook her head. "That is not true. I never asked about his money." Before anyone could respond, my lawyer sent several documents to my phone. They included emails, dates, and the name of the person who had contacted his office. Daniel opened the files and his expression changed instantly. The email had been sent from Melissa's personal account. She covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. I was only curious, she whispered. Daniel slowly shook his head. First my mother's dignity, now my father's estate. How many lies have you been hiding? The guests stood in complete silence. Nobody looked at Melissa with anger anymore. They looked at her with disappointment. Emily quietly reached for my hand. Even after everything she had endured that evening, she gently squeezed it, reminding me that kindness had always been stronger than cruelty. Just as Daniel was about to speak again, the ballroom doors opened one more time. A police officer stepped inside and looked directly toward Melissa. Excuse me, he said. I need to ask Ms. Melissa a few questions regarding a complaint that was filed this afternoon. The entire room froze once again. The police officer slowly walked into the center of the ballroom, while every guest watched in complete silence. Melissa looked terrified. There must be some mistake, she said, trying to force a smile. The officer calmly replied, I am not here to arrest anyone. I only need to ask you a few questions about an online complaint. Daniel stepped aside without saying a word. Melissa followed the officer into the hallway, and the ballroom remained silent. 10 minutes felt like an hour. Emily sat beside me, still wearing my suit jacket over her head. I held her hand and quietly reminded her that none of what happened tonight had changed the incredible woman she was. She smiled through her tears, but I could still see the pain in her eyes. Finally, the doors opened again. Melissa returned looking completely exhausted. The officer nodded politely toward me before leaving the venue. Daniel immediately asked, What happened? Melissa looked down at the floor. Someone reported the wedding video after it was uploaded online. My heart skipped a beat. Uploaded? I asked. Melissa slowly nodded. One of my bridesmaids posted the prank on social media only a few minutes after it happened. It has already been viewed thousands of times. Several guests gasped. Emily quietly closed her eyes. The humiliation she experienced inside the ballroom had already spread far beyond those walls. Daniel took out his phone and searched for the video. Within seconds, he found it. The comments beneath it made his face turn pale. Thousands of strangers were defending Emily. Many were condemning Melissa for humiliating a cancer survivor. Some recognized Emily from the local cancer support foundation where she had volunteered after completing chemotherapy. Daniel slowly lowered his phone and looked at his wife. You wanted everyone to remember this wedding, he said quietly. They will, but not for the reason you imagined. Melissa broke down in tears, realizing that the moment she planned as entertainment had become public evidence of the worst decision of her life. Just then, my phone vibrated again. It was a message from someone whose name I had not seen in years. As I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. The sender claimed to know the real reason Melissa targeted Emily, and it had nothing to do with a wedding prank. My hands trembled as I opened the message. It came from a woman named Rebecca, someone Emily and I had met years earlier at the Cancer Support Center. Her words were short but impossible to ignore. Melissa did not humiliate Emily because of a prank. She has been jealous of her for a long time. Please let me explain before you judge this message. I immediately called the number. Rebecca answered with a shaky voice and told me she had remained silent for months because she hoped Melissa would change. Instead, she watched everything fall apart. She explained that after Emily recovered from cancer, she became a volunteer at the support center, comforting patients who had just received the same diagnosis she once feared. Many people admired her strength, kindness, and courage. Rebecca quietly said, Melissa used to complain that everyone praised Emily. She once said she was tired of hearing people call your wife inspiring. She wanted to be the center of attention on her wedding day, and she believed embarrassing. Emily would make everyone focus on her. Instead, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Daniel listened beside me, and every word broke his heart a little more. When the call ended, he walked toward Melissa with tears in his eyes. Tell me she is lying, he whispered. Melissa lowered her head and remained silent. That silence answered every question. Emily looked at her with sadness rather than anger. I celebrated every success you had, she said softly. I loved you like my own daughter. I never imagined you saw me as your competition. Melissa burst into tears and fell to her knees. I was jealous, she admitted. Everywhere we went, people admired your strength. I wanted this day to be about me, and I made the worst decision of my life. No one in the ballroom spoke. The truth was finally complete. It was never about a harmless joke. It was about envy, pride, and a cruel desire to steal someone else's dignity. Daniel closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and quietly said, "Then our marriage was built on a lie from the very beginning." The silence that followed was heavier than anything we had experienced that night. Daniel stood motionless for several seconds after Melissa confessed. No one in the ballroom dared to interrupt the silence. The wedding that had begun with music and celebration now felt more like a courtroom where every truth had finally been exposed. Melissa slowly wiped away her tears and whispered, "I know I do not deserve forgiveness, but if I could relive this day, I would stop myself before I ever touched Emily's wig." Emily looked at her with tired eyes. There was no hatred in her voice, only heartbreak. "Forgiveness is possible," she said quietly. "Trust is much harder to rebuild." Those words echoed through the room. Melissa lowered her head because she knew they were true. Daniel removed his wedding ring and held it in his hand for a long moment. "Marriage begins with respect," he said calmly. "Tonight I learned that respect cannot survive where cruelty lives." He gently placed the ring on the table beside them. There was no shouting, no anger, only disappointment. Several guests quietly began leaving the ballroom, many stopping to hug Emily before they walked out. One elderly woman kissed Emily's forehead and said, "You are the strongest bride's mother I have ever met." Emily smiled through her tears. For the first time that evening, as the ballroom slowly emptied, Daniel walked toward us. He wrapped his arms around his mother and cried like a little boy again. "Mom, I am so sorry. I should have protected you." Emily held him tightly and replied, "You made a mistake by trusting the wrong person. Do not spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for someone else's choices." Placed my hand on my son's shoulder and felt hope returning. For the first time that night, we had lost a celebration, but we had not lost our family. Just as we prepared to leave the venue together, the wedding coordinator hurried toward us carrying a small velvet box that had been found beneath the bridal table. "Mr. Carter," she said nervously, "I think you need to see what was hidden inside this." I slowly opened the small velvet box while Daniel and Emily stood beside me. Inside was not a piece of jewelry. It was a folded, handwritten letter with my son's name on the front. Daniel carefully opened it, and after reading the first few lines, tears immediately filled his eyes. It was a letter Emily had written months before the wedding while she was still recovering from chemotherapy. She had planned to give it to Daniel privately after the ceremony. In the letter, she thanked him for being the greatest blessing of her life. She wrote that surviving cancer had taught her one simple lesson: love people while you still have the chance. She explained that she and I had quietly saved money for years so we could help Daniel and his future family buy their first home. Enclosed with the letter was a certified bank document showing a gift of $500,000 that we planned to transfer to the newlyweds the morning after the wedding. The ballroom became completely silent once again. Melissa stared at the document, unable to believe what she was seeing. Emily had planned to give her not only unconditional love but also a future, free from financial worry. Instead of receiving that gift with gratitude, she had humiliated the very woman who made it possible. Daniel could no longer hold back his tears. He embraced his mother and whispered, "Mom, I do not deserve this." Emily gently smiled and replied, "This gift was never a reward. It was a mother's final dream for her son." Daniel slowly folded the document and placed it back inside the box. Then he looked at Melissa one last time. "Money can build a house," he said quietly, "but kindness is what builds a family. Tonight I lost a wife, but I almost lost something far more valuable. I almost lost the parents who spent their entire lives loving me." As we walked out of the ballroom together, no one applauded and no one celebrated. The only thing anyone remembered from that wedding was not the dress, the flowers, or the music. They remembered a woman who survived cancer with courage, a husband who stood beside her when the world laughed, and a painful reminder that dignity is worth far more than any celebration. Sometimes the greatest victory is not getting revenge. It is walking away with your family, your self-respect, and a heart that refused to become as cruel as those who tried to break it. 2 weeks passed after the wedding, but the memories of that night refused to fade. Messages arrived from complete strangers every day. Some had seen the video online. Others had heard the story through friends who attended the wedding. Nearly every letter said the same thing. "Please tell Emily," she reminded us, "what real courage looks like." She read every message, with quiet tears, not because she wanted sympathy, but because she finally understood that kindness leaves a mark long after cruelty is forgotten. Daniel moved into a small apartment while he sorted out his future. He visited us almost every evening, helping around the house the way he did when he was a teenager. One afternoon he looked at me and quietly said, "Dad, I spent so much time planning a perfect wedding that I forgot the most important thing. Character matters more than appearances." I smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. Life has a painful way of teaching its greatest lessons. A month later, the divorce between Daniel and Melissa was finalized. There was no public argument and no fight over money. Daniel asked for only one thing. He wanted peace. Before leaving the courthouse, Melissa slowly walked toward Emily with tears in her eyes. "I know I have no right to ask," she whispered, "but I hope one day you will remember me for something other than my worst moment." Emily looked at her for several seconds before answering. "I truly hope you become someone completely different from the person you were that night. That would be the only apology that really matters." Melissa nodded, unable to speak. She quietly walked away without looking back. As we drove home, Daniel sat in the back seat in complete silence. A year has passed since the day that changed our family forever. Life is quieter now. Emily's hair has grown back, soft and silver, and although she no longer needs the wig, she keeps it in a small box inside our bedroom closet. One afternoon, I asked why she had never thrown it away. She smiled and said, "Because it reminds me that I survived the hardest battle of my life." Every time I hear those words, I feel proud of the woman I married more than 4 decades ago. Daniel rebuilt his life slowly. He returned to work, spent weekends with us, and volunteered beside Emily at the Cancer Support Center. Watching him comfort families facing the same fear we once lived through showed me how much he had changed. He no longer measured people by charm or appearances. He measured them by kindness. One Saturday morning, a young woman receiving chemotherapy recognized Emily from the wedding video that had spread across the internet. She walked over with tears in her eyes and quietly said, "Because of you, I stopped hiding my own bald head. You gave me courage." Emily hugged her without saying a word. I realized then that the most painful night of our lives had become a source of strength for someone else. As we walked back to the car, Daniel smiled and said, "Mom, the people who tried to embarrass you only made the world see how incredible you really are." Emily laughed softly and replied, "Real beauty has never come from hair. It comes from the way we treat people." Looked at both of them and silently thanked God. We had lost a wedding, but we had gained something far greater. We had found peace, wisdom, and a deeper love for one another. Looking back now, I understand that the cruelest moment of our lives became the beginning of our greatest healing. And if my story leaves you with one lesson, let it be this. People may laugh at your scars for a moment, but they will always remember the courage you showed while carrying them. Looking back now, I no longer remember that wedding as the day my family fell apart. I remember it as the day the truth finally came into the light. For weeks, I kept asking myself why God allowed such a painful moment to happen. Then I realized something I had never understood before. If that prank had never happened, Daniel might have spent the rest of his life with someone who believed humiliation was entertainment and kindness was weakness. What felt like the worst day of our lives became the day that protected our family's future. Emily often tells people that surviving cancer taught her how precious life is, but surviving that wedding taught her how precious dignity is. She never allowed bitterness to take root in her heart. She forgave Melissa, not because Melissa deserved it, but because Emily refused to carry anger for the rest of her life. That is the kind of woman she has always been. As for me, I learned that a husband is not measured by how loudly he speaks, but by whether he stands beside his wife when she can no longer stand by herself. If I had one chance to relive that evening, I still would not change the pain we endured, because it revealed the character of every person in that ballroom. Daniel rebuilt his life with patience instead of bitterness. Emily continued encouraging cancer patients who had lost hope. I simply became more grateful for every ordinary morning we were given together. Sometimes people ask whether our family ever truly recovered. My answer is always the same. We did not recover. We grew stronger. The scars remained, but they no longer controlled us. If you are listening to my story today, remember this one lesson. Never laugh at a battle you have never had to fight. The person standing quietly beside you may have survived a war that nobody else could see. Show kindness whenever you can. Protect the people you love. And never trade someone's dignity for a few seconds of laughter. In the end, weddings are forgotten, flowers fade, and photographs grow old. But the way you make another human being feel will stay with them for the rest of their life. That is the legacy I hope my family leaves behind. And that is the story I wanted to share with you. Thank you for listening.